Millionaire, on the way to the airport, sees a beggar with a baby in the rain and gives her the keys to his house. But when he returns, he's shocked by what he finds. The storm hit the city without warning, turning the streets into rivers of water and mud. Lightning tore through the sky, followed by the rumbling of thunder that made the windows of the buildings tremble. Inside a luxurious black car, George Robinson watched the rain trickling down the glass, lost in his own thoughts. The driver navigated cautiously through the flooded streets, while George mentally reviewed the details of his upcoming trip. As the CEO of one of the country's largest financial corporations, his life revolved around numbers, contracts, and decisions that moved millions. He never allowed himself to be distracted until he saw something that shattered his focus. On the opposite sidewalk, under the flickering light of a street lamp, a woman was huddled, clutching a baby to her chest. The sight hit him like a punch to the gut. Sarah was trembling from head to toe, her soaked brown hair clinging to her shoulders. Her face was pale, and her lips had turned a bluish shade from the cold. But what caught George's attention the most was the way she held the child, desperately, as if the entire world was against them, and that embrace was the only thing keeping them safe. "Stop the car!" The order left his lips before he could even think. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror, confused. "Sir?" "I said stop now." The car glided smoothly to the curb, and George pushed open the door, stepping into the rain without caring that the icy water was soaking his expensive suit. He walked purposefully towards Sarah, who stared at him wide-eyed like a frightened animal. "What are you doing here?" His voice was firm but not harsh. Sarah clutched Emma tighter. The little girl whimpered, discomforted by the cold and dampness. Sarah lifted her face to look at him, clearly on edge. I have nowhere to go," she answered, her voice weak, trembling, barely audible over the sound of the rain. George had never been a man driven by emotion. He never got involved in other people's struggles. But in that moment, something inside him cracked. He looked around. The street was nearly empty, with only a few people rushing to find shelter. No one else seemed to notice the woman and child, as if they were invisible. "Come with me," he said. Sarah took a step back. "I can't." "Would you rather stay here?" George raised an eyebrow, impatience creeping into his tone. He didn't understand why he was insisting, but he knew that simply leaving them there wasn't an option. Sarah looked down at Emma, who was now quietly sobbing. Her heart ached. What else could she do? She had spent the past few months just trying to survive, accepting whatever help she could find to make sure her daughter had at least something to eat. But a wealthy stranger offering help out of nowhere, that was hard to believe. George noticed her hesitation and sighed. He pulled out his wallet, took a card and held it out to her. "My estate is a few miles from here. You can go there. My driver will take you." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "You're giving me your house?" He scoffed, his patience wearing thin. "Just for one night, so your daughter can have a roof over her head and a warm bed. After that, do whatever you want." She glanced at Emma again. The little girl was exhausted, her tiny eyes struggling to stay open despite the cold. Making up her mind, Sarah slowly nodded. "Okay." George handed her the keys to the mansion and stepped back. "Take them there," he ordered the driver, before getting back into the car and heading toward the airport. But even in the comfort of the vehicle, knowing that in a few hours he would be far from there, his mind remained stuck on the image of that woman and her child. And for the first time in a long while, George felt that something inside him was changing. Sarah stepped out of the car with Emma in her arms, feeling the cold night wind cut through her damp skin. The mansion's gate opened automatically, and she hesitantly walked along the long stone driveway leading to the imposing residence. It was grand, elegant, and intimidating, with towering walls and wide windows that seemed to silently observe her approach. She stopped in front of the door, gripping the keys George had given her. Her fingers trembled, both from the cold and from uncertainty. "What am I doing here?" she murmured to herself. Emma stirred in her arms, letting out a small whimper of discomfort, pulling Sarah back to reality. No matter how surreal it felt to be there, the most important thing was her daughter. With a deep breath, she turned the key and stepped inside. The mansion's warm air immediately wrapped around her, creating a stark contrast to the freezing streets outside. The interior was even more luxurious than she had imagined. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling in the entry hall, reflecting the soft glow of scattered lights. The marble floor gleamed, and sophisticated furniture decorated the space with impeccable perfection, as if no one truly lived there. Sarah moved cautiously, her wet feet leaving marks on the floor. The house was silent, almost cold in its perfection. She glanced at Emma, whose sleepy eyes fluttered open and shut from exhaustion. Eventually, Sarah found what appeared to be the living room. A massive sofa and plush armchairs were arranged around a fireplace, which, to her surprise, was already lit. The golden flicker of the fire danced across the walls, bringing a touch of warmth to the place. That was when she noticed the butler standing near the staircase. "Ma'am," he addressed her politely, though his tone carried a hint of curiosity. Sarah instinctively held Emma closer to her chest. Mr. George gave me permission to stay here for the night." The man studied her for a moment and, to her relief, did not question her further. "Let me assist you then. I will prepare a room. There is a bathroom with a hot bath waiting. It seems you could use it." The mention of a hot bath nearly made Sarah break down. "Thank you," she said, her voice tight with emotion. The butler led her upstairs to one of the guest rooms. The space was large and elegantly decorated, but none of that mattered. What truly caught her attention was the attached bathroom, where a white marble bathtub was already filling with steaming hot water. She wasted no time. As soon as the butler left, Sarah carefully undressed Emma and eased her into the warm water. The little girl let out a soft sigh of relief, her tiny eyes closing as the heat soothed her chilled body. "There we go, my love. Now you can rest," Sarah whispered, pressing a gentle kiss to her daughter's forehead. After washing her carefully, Sarah wrapped Emma in a soft towel and dressed her in clean pajamas she found in the closet. As if sensing that she was finally safe, Emma fell asleep almost instantly, sinking into a deep, peaceful slumber, one she hadn't had in a long time. Sarah carefully laid her down on the large bed and pulled the covers over her. Once Emma was settled, Sarah allowed herself a moment for herself. She stepped into the bathtub, closing her eyes as the hot water enveloped her, melting away the tension in her body. She washed her hair, scrubbed away the dirt of the streets, and for the first time in what felt like forever, let herself feel a moment of relief. When she emerged from the bath, she found a tray of food on the bedside table. The aroma of hot soup and fresh bread made her swallow hard. How long had it been since she'd had a proper meal? She ate slowly, feeling the weight of exhaustion finally settle in. The mansion still felt surreal, but for now, she would allow herself just one night of peace. If this was a dream, she didn't want to wake up. Meanwhile, aboard his private jet, George reclined in his leather seat, but he couldn't relax. The storm continued outside, gently rocking the aircraft. His assistant sat across from him, going over the details of the trip, but he barely registered a word she was saying. All he could think about was the woman and the baby he had left in his house. Why the hell had he done that? He wasn't the type to act on impulse. He never let emotions cloud his judgment. But something about that young mother standing in the rain had shaken him in a way he couldn't explain. Maybe it was the way she held the child, as if she were fighting against the entire world. Alone, he let out a frustrated sigh, annoyed with himself. "Mr. Robinson?" His assistant's voice pulled him back to the present. What? I asked if you'd like to review tomorrow's schedule. He pinched the bridge of his nose, trying to compose himself. No, we'll go over it when we land. His assistant nodded and returned to reviewing her documents. George leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. But even in the quiet of the cabin, he couldn't shake the image of Sarah and Emma from his mind. The roar of the private jet's engines was replaced by the sound of tires gliding smoothly over the wet runway. George unfastened his seatbelt and let out a heavy sigh. The flight that was supposed to take him to an international conference had been cancelled due to technical issues, forcing him to return home earlier than planned. He grabbed his phone and ignored the dozens of emails piling up on the screen. He wasn't in the mood for work. Strangely, all he could think about at that moment was returning to the mansion and finding it as empty as always. "The car is ready, Mr. Robinson," one of the pilots informed him. George simply nodded and stepped off the aircraft. The rain was still falling lightly over the city, and he quickly got into the black Mercedes waiting for him on the private runway. The drive home was silent, with George staring at the urban landscape through the window. When the car finally passed through the mansion's gates, he felt a strange weight settle in his chest. He couldn't explain it, but the house seemed different. He stepped out of the car and entered the foyer, expecting to be greeted by the usual silence, but instead he heard something unusual: laughter. His gaze shifted toward the living room, where an unexpected scene unfolded. Sarah was sitting on the plush carpet with Emma in her lap, holding a stuffed animal and making funny voices. The little girl burst into giggles, clapping her tiny hands while her mother laughed along, free of tension or fear. George stood in the doorway, watching. It was such an ordinary scene and yet completely foreign inside this house. For years, this space had been nothing more than a beautiful and functional place, empty of life. Now, it felt different, warmer. He wasn't sure how long he had been standing there, just observing. But suddenly, Sarah looked up and saw him. The laughter vanished instantly from her lips. She stiffened, holding Emma closer, as if bracing for reprimand. George took a step forward, and her posture grew even more tense. "You're back," Sarah said quietly, as if afraid of the answer. He crossed his arms. "My flight was cancelled." Silence settled between them. Emma, oblivious to the tension, reached for the stuffed animal, babbling something incomprehensible. George glanced at the baby for a moment. He had never really paid attention to children before, but there was something fascinating about the purity of her joy, the way her innocence seemed to brighten everything around her. He shifted his focus back to Sarah. "You're still here," he noted, though there was no accusation in his tone. She hesitated before responding. "I thought I'd only stay one night, but Emma was so tired, and your butler insisted that we stay a little longer." George raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Fred suggested you stay?" Sarah nodded slowly. "He said the house was too big to be empty." George let out a quiet, almost imperceptible scoff. That was exactly the kind of thing Fred would say. Sarah continued watching him cautiously, as if expecting him to ask her to leave at any moment. But to her surprise, and maybe even to his own, George simply sighed and asked, "Do you need anything else?" Sarah blinked, clearly confused. "What? Does Emma have everything she needs? Clothes? Food?" Sarah opened her mouth to reply, but hesitated. She hadn't expected this reaction. She had anticipated coldness, distance, maybe even irritation, but not this subdued concern. She swallowed hard and shook her head. "No, we have everything we need." George merely nodded and walked past them, heading toward the table where his staff always left a glass of whiskey for him. He picked it up, but didn't drink right away. Why did this feel so natural? He, George Robinson, A man known for his coldness, standing in his own living room with a woman and a baby he barely knew, and not feeling the urge to send them away. He turned around again and saw Sarah lifting Emma into her arms, about to leave the room. "Sarah." She stopped, her shoulders tensing. "Yes?" George studied her for a moment before simply saying, "Good night." She blinked, surprised, before murmuring, "Good night," and then she left, taking Emma with her. George remained where he was, staring at the space where warmth and life had existed just moments before. He took a sip of whiskey, feeling the burn as it slid down his throat. Yes, something inside him was definitely changing. Time passed in a strangely natural way inside the Robinson mansion. What had once been just a temporary shelter for Sarah and Emma now felt like something else, something undefined. George never asked them to leave, and Sarah, no matter how much she tried to convince herself that she should go, couldn't find the strength to walk away. The mansion, once cold and impersonal, began to come alive with Emma's presence. Her childish laughter echoed through the halls, adding a softness that contrasted with George's rigid, relentless routine. He noticed the change in subtle ways. At first, it was just a strange sensation upon entering the house and no longer being met with the absolute silence that had accompanied him for years. Then, it became an almost unconscious habit. Pausing for a moment at the entrance to the living room to watch Sarah playing with Emma, or realizing that the scent of fresh tea and homemade food was now a part of the atmosphere. It was strange, but it wasn't bad. Sarah noticed the changes too. At first, she tensed up whenever George was around, expecting him to say it was time for them to leave, but he never did. He never questioned their presence, never showed any irritation at finding them there. He simply accepted it. And with that acceptance, a strange balance began to form between them. George caught himself watching Sarah more often than he cared to admit. There was a delicacy in her movements as she cared for Emma, an unwavering tenderness that made him wonder how many battles this woman had fought to protect her daughter. One night, after a long day at work, George walked into the living room and found Sarah sitting on the couch, holding a cup of tea while watching Emma sleep in the bassinet beside her. She looked up at him and offered a small smile. "You're home early today." George was caught off guard by the familiarity in her words, as if this were normal, as if it were routine for him to come home and be greeted by her. He walked over to the bar and poured himself a glass of whiskey before sitting in the armchair across from her. "How was your day?" he asked, realizing too late that he had never asked anyone that question before. Sarah raised her eyebrows, surprised. "It was peaceful. Emma played a lot today. And you?" George swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching the amber liquid move before answering. "The same as always. Meetings, reports, decisions that move millions." Sarah let out a quiet chuckle. "That must be exhausting, carrying the world on your shoulders." George looked up at her, surprised by her insight. "Sometimes it is." Sarah bit her lip, hesitating before asking, "Do you like what you do?" He blinked, as if he had never really considered the question before. "I'm good at what I do." "But that doesn't answer my question." George fell silent for a moment before shrugging. "I suppose I never gave myself the luxury of thinking about it." Sarah studied him, intrigued. The media portrayed him as ruthless, someone who only cared about money and power. But here, in this moment, she saw something different. "And what would you do if you could choose anything?" she asked softly. George let out a quiet scoff. "You think someone like me has that kind of freedom?" "I think we all do. The question is whether we have the courage to use it." George held her gaze for a moment, caught by the intensity in her brown eyes. She wasn't trying to impress him, wasn't trying to flatter him like so many others he had known. She was just being honest, and that disarmed him in a way he hadn't expected. He looked away, taking a sip of his whiskey before murmuring, "If I could choose anything, I'd choose to figure out why this house doesn't feel as empty lately." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. For a brief moment, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was understanding, and in that space, without either of them realizing it, an unspoken bond began to form. The morning started peacefully at the Robinson mansion. Sunlight streamed softly through the windows, casting golden hues over the sophisticated furniture. Sarah was in the kitchen, preparing coffee, while Emma played in her playpen in the living room, babbling incomprehensible words to her toys. George had already left early for a meeting, and Sarah, even though she knew this wasn't her permanent place, was beginning to settle into a routine. After so long living without stability, waking up without fear of tomorrow felt like a small luxury. But the peace didn't last long. The doorbell rang through the house, cutting through the comfortable silence. Fred, the butler, went to answer it, but before he could even offer a greeting, a sharp and impatient female voice filled the space. "Where is George?" Sarah, stirring sugar into her tea, frowned at the unfamiliar voice. Seconds later, a tall, elegant woman stepped into the kitchen, her heels clicking against the cold floor. Her assessing gaze landed directly on Sarah, as if she were an unwanted stain in the otherwise pristine setting. "Who are you?" the woman asked, crossing her arms. Sarah didn't need much time to figure out who she was. Everything about Rebecca Clark exuded arrogance and sophistication, from the perfectly tailored dress to the expensive perfume lingering in the air. But more than that, it was the way she carried herself, as if she belonged there. "I'm Sarah," she replied calmly. "Sarah." "What?" Rebecca arched a perfectly shaped eyebrow, scanning her from head to toe. Sarah narrowed her eyes. "Just Sarah." Before Rebecca could respond, a soft sound caught her attention. Emma had pulled herself up against the bars of her playpen, her curious eyes fixed on the newcomer, an innocent smile on her lips. Rebecca's gaze darkened with disbelief. "What is a child doing here?" The question, laced with barely disguised contempt, sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "My daughter and I are staying here for now." Rebecca let out a sharp laugh, spinning on her heels. "Staying in George's house?" She turned to Fred as if expecting him to deny it. When the butler remained silent, she snapped her gaze back to Sarah. "Is this some kind of joke?" Sarah didn't respond. There was nothing she could say that would change this woman's mind. Rebecca exhaled dramatically before pulling out her phone and dialing a number. "George, we need to talk, now." George arrived home less than an hour later. The fact that Rebecca had insisted on meeting at his house rather than his office had already irritated him. When he entered the living room, he found her standing in the center, arms crossed, impatience written all over her face. "Well, it's about time you got here." "What's going on, Rebecca?" George asked, not in the mood for games. "What's going on?" She let out a humorless laugh. "That's what I should be asking you. Since when do you turn your house into a shelter for strangers?" George frowned. "This is none of your business." "None of my business?" She narrowed her eyes. "George, do you even know who that woman is?" "I know enough." Rebecca stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with a mix of fury and satisfaction. "No, George. You think you know. But since when has a man like you been so naive? Since when do you let yourself be manipulated so easily?" He remained silent. Rebecca noticed and smirked. She leaned in slightly. "Look at her, George. Young, with a child in her arms, nowhere to go. And suddenly, she ends up in the mansion of one of the wealthiest men in the country. Doesn't that sound a little too convenient?" A discomfort settled in George's stomach. Rebecca seized the moment, pressing further. "She probably did her research on you, knew you'd be an easy target. You've always been impulsive when something tugs at your conscience, haven't you?" She shook her head, feigning concern. "I'm just trying to protect you." George averted his gaze, His mind suddenly clouded with thoughts that hadn't been there before. He remembered the moment he found Sarah in the rain, the way she hesitated before accepting his help. What if Rebecca was right? What if he had been naive? When he looked up again, he saw Sarah standing at the entrance of the room, holding Emma in her arms. She had heard everything. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. She saw the doubt in George's eyes. It wasn't just what Rebecca had said, it was the fact that he was actually considering it. "You really think I'm here out of self-interest?" Her voice was soft, barely a whisper. George hesitated, and that was enough. A burning sensation filled Sarah's chest. She had never expected much from people. The world had shown her time and time again that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. But George, he was the first person to extend a hand without asking for anything in return, or at least that's what she thought. Now, seeing the suspicion in his eyes, she felt tainted, as if she really had to justify seeking shelter for her daughter. She held Emma closer and lifted her chin. "Don't worry, Mr. Robinson. I won't stay where I'm not welcome." George opened his mouth to say something, but Sarah was already turning away. She climbed the stairs quickly, gathering the few belongings she had. George felt a lump form in his throat, but he couldn't move. And just like that, Sarah left the mansion, taking Emma with her, taking the warmth he had only just begun to recognize. Silence had never bothered George Robinson. For years, he had appreciated the absolute tranquility of his mansion. Coming home after an exhausting day of work to find everything in perfect order, no noise, no distractions, had always seemed like the ultimate definition of control, something he valued deeply. But now the silence was unbearable. He stepped into the foyer, tossing his keys onto the side table without bothering to remove his jacket. His eyes instinctively drifted to the living room. The rug where Emma used to play was empty. The couch where Sarah would sit with her evening tea looked untouched. The faint, sweet scent of lavender that had once lingered in the air, probably from Sarah's clothes or the soap she used, had disappeared. The house hadn't just returned to what it was before. It felt worse. George let out a heavy sigh and loosened his tie, walking toward the bar to pour himself a glass of whiskey. The amber liquid swirled inside the crystal tumbler, but he didn't drink it right away. The weight of loneliness, something he had never noticed before, was now suffocating. George was not a man who regretted things. He had always made decisions based on logic and reason. But this time, something deep inside him screamed that he had made a mistake. Since the night Sarah walked out the door, he had been trying to justify his reaction. Rebecca had been right about one thing. He really didn't know much about Sarah. She could have been anyone. She could have, theoretically, been trying to take advantage of him. But then why did every fiber of his being reject that idea? Why, instead of feeling relieved that his house was back to normal, did he feel an unbearable emptiness? Why couldn't he get the image of Sarah holding Emma in her arms, looking at him with genuine hurt, out of his head? He ran a hand down his face, muttering a quiet curse. He couldn't keep going like this. He needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. The next morning, George called one of his most discreet contacts, Daniel Evans, a private investigator known for his efficiency and absolute confidentiality. "I need you to find out everything about a woman named Sarah," George said bluntly, providing the few details he had. "Any particular reason for the investigation?" Daniel asked, intrigued. George hesitated. He could say it was just a precaution, that he wanted to make sure he hadn't made a mistake by letting her into his home. But that would be a lie. "Just find out the truth," he said before hanging up. The following days were hell. George tried to focus on work, but his mind kept wandering. During important meetings, he caught himself glancing at his phone, waiting for Daniel's call. At night, his house felt colder than ever and he barely slept. It wasn't until 5 days later that he finally received the long-awaited call. "I have the report. Can we meet?" "Now," George replied immediately. They met at a discreet restaurant downtown. Daniel arrived with a folder full of documents and a serious expression. George took the report without a word, feeling his heart pound faster than he wanted to admit. He flipped open the first page and began to read. With each new detail he absorbed, a heavy weight settled in his chest. Sarah was not a con artist. Quite the opposite. She had been a brilliant medical student with a promising future until tragedy struck. She lost her parents in an accident and, alone in the world, ended up with Ryan, a man who initially seemed like her safe harbor, but soon revealed his true nature. Ryan manipulated her, pulled her away from her studies, and made her believe she was completely dependent on him. When Emma was born, his true colors became clear. Not only was he abusive, but he also drained the little money she had inherited, leaving her with nothing. Sarah had fled. She spent months just trying to survive, moving from shelter to shelter, taking any temporary work she could find to feed her daughter. But nothing was ever enough. That was how George had found her that rainy night. She hadn't been trying to deceive him. There was no scheme, only desperation, only a mother trying to protect her child at any cost. George closed his eyes for a moment, guilt burning through him. He hadn't just misjudged her. He had hurt her. And worse, he had allowed Rebecca to plant doubts in his mind about a woman who had already been wounded by so many before him. George let out a long sigh and shut the report. Daniel studied his expression and smirked slightly. "I think you know what you need to do." George opened his eyes, now filled with dark determination. Yes, he knew, and he wouldn't rest until he made things right. The car glided through the narrow city streets, passing old buildings and tight alleyways. George drove without urgency, something rare for him. He couldn't afford to make a mistake now, not after everything he had learned. Daniel's report still weighed on his mind, every word carved into his conscience like a blade. Sarah had lost everything, fought against a cruel man, been left to fend for herself, and he, who had every resource to help her, had only judged her. Now he needed to make it right. After a few phone calls and a discreet bribe to a security guard at a shelter on the west side of the city, he finally discovered where Sarah was. When he parked in front of the modest building, something unfamiliar tightened in his chest. Anxiety. George Robinson was not a man who got anxious. He closed million-dollar deals without blinking, made tough decisions without hesitation. But standing there on the damp sidewalk, he realized he had never been more afraid of failing. With a deep breath, he ran a hand through his hair and stepped inside the shelter. The space was small and simple, with peeling walls and the faint scent of weak coffee in the air. A few women sat on plastic chairs, speaking in low voices. Children played with building blocks on a worn-out rug. And then he saw her. Sarah was sitting in the corner, holding Emma in her lap, murmuring something to the little girl. Her hair was tied up in a messy bun, and exhaustion was clear on her face. Yet despite everything, there was something unshaken about her, something strong. George took a step forward, and as if sensing his presence, Sarah looked up. What he saw in her eyes made his chest tighten. There was no surprise, no fiery anger, only coldness. Sarah remained silent for a few seconds before letting out a long sigh. "What are you doing here, George?" Her voice was controlled, but it carried a deep exhaustion that he couldn't ignore. George glanced at Emma, who was playing absently with a stuffed toy, oblivious to the tension between the adults. He pulled out a chair and sat down in front of them. "I came to apologize." Sarah let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Apologize?" George nodded. "I was wrong." She narrowed her eyes. "I already knew that." George took a slow breath, searching for the right words. I was an idiot, he admitted bluntly. I let Rebecca poison my mind, and at the moment you needed someone to believe in you the most, I was just like everyone else who judged you without knowing your story. Sarah said nothing. She simply held his gaze, waiting. George ran a hand down his face, frustrated with himself. I hurt you. I saw it in your eyes when you left my house. And since then, that house hasn't been the same. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. Are you expecting me to feel sorry for you? No, I want you to forgive me. Sarah looked away for a moment, her fingers absent-mindedly running through Emma's hair. I trusted you, George, not because you're rich, but because I thought there was something genuine in your kindness. But at the first sign of trouble, you looked at me the same way everyone else did, like someone who didn't deserve to be trusted. George closed his eyes for a brief moment. I know. Sarah exhaled heavily, hugging Emma a little closer. I can't just erase what happened. George opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, a soft voice interrupted them. Uncle George! They both turned toward Emma, who was smiling innocently, reaching out her little arms to him. George felt something tighten in his chest. Slowly, he leaned forward and picked her up. She snuggled against him without hesitation, resting her head on his shoulder. Sarah watched the scene, her expression faltering. She could hold onto her anger. She could reject George's attempt to make amends. But how could she ignore the fact that her daughter trusted him? How could she ignore the genuine regret in the eyes of a man she once believed incapable of caring for anyone? George held Emma carefully, his gaze returning to Sarah. I'm not asking you to forget what I did, he said, his voice rough. But I'm asking for a second chance to do things the right way. Sarah kept her eyes on him, her heart warring with her mind. She could refuse. She could turn her back and move on without him, but something inside her whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was a new beginning. She took a deep breath before speaking. If I come back, George, things have to be different. I can't live under the shadow of doubt again. George nodded immediately. Never again. Silence settled between them. Then Sarah lowered her gaze and murmured, All right. George let out the breath he hadn't even realized he was holding. And there, in the middle of a simple shelter, with Emma sleeping in his arms, he knew he finally had a second chance. Now it was up to him to prove he was worthy of it. The return to the mansion was silent, but it carried a different energy. Sarah and Emma were back, but not like before. This time there was no uncertainty, no implied deadline. George wasn't taking them in on impulse or out of charity. He wanted them there because somehow they had become part of his life. And this time he would get everything right. The first few days were an adjustment for everyone. Sarah, still cautious, watched George closely, trying to understand if this change was real or just a fleeting reflection of guilt. But soon, she realized, he was different. George didn't just come home earlier, he made a point to be present. He joined them for meals, showed up on nights when Emma refused to sleep, and even started noticing little things, like how Sarah liked chamomile tea before bed, or how Emma loved listening to bedtime stories. He wasn't trying to make up for a mistake. He was building something new, and despite herself, Sarah found her guard slipping. One night, as they sat on the veranda after Emma had fallen asleep, they shared an easy conversation. No accusations, no expectations, just a quiet understanding that something between them was changing. Sarah talked about her interrupted dreams, how much she loved medicine, and how she still wished to go back to school one day. George listened intently, without judgment, and the next day he discreetly began researching ways to help her resume her studies. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, a new routine took shape. Emma, more attached to George with each passing day, would wait for him to come home as if it were the highlight of her day. and George found himself realizing that the little girl's presence filled spaces inside him he hadn't even known were empty. Rebecca showed up only once. She walked into the mansion as if she still had a claim there. But the moment she saw Sarah and Emma in the living room, she knew her place in his life had ended. She made one last attempt, hinting that George was making a mistake by getting emotionally involved, but he only stared at her, his expression unreadable. "The mistake was letting you be part of my life for so long," he said coldly. For the first time, Rebecca had no response. With a forced smile and one final look of disdain at Sarah, she walked out the front door and never came back. Time passed, and what had once been an unlikely arrangement became something natural. George, without even realizing it, had become as much a part of Emma's life as she had become a part of his. And then, on an ordinary afternoon, it happened. He was sitting on the floor of the living room, holding Emma in his lap as they worked on a puzzle together. Sarah watched from the kitchen, laughing quietly at the exaggerated faces George made to entertain the little girl. Emma, in her innocent way, turned to him and stretched out her tiny arms. "Daddy, help me!" The world seemed to stop for a moment. Sarah froze, her teacup forgotten in her hands. George felt something tighten in his chest, something deep, something that clicked into place. He looked at Sarah, searching for her reaction. She didn't say anything, but in her eyes he saw something he had never seen before. Trust. And in that moment, George understood. It didn't matter how this had started. What they had now was real. Sarah walked over and sat beside them, her smile soft but genuine. George lifted Emma into his arms, holding her close. And for the first time, he felt like he had everything he had ever needed. A family. And he would never let it go. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.